In October of 1943, according to a story that has circulated in certain quarters for 7 decades, the United States Navy conducted a secret experiment at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard that made a warship invisible to the naked eye, teleported it instantaneously to Norfolk, Virginia, and back again, and left its crew members fused into the steel of the hull, driven insane or capable of walking through solid walls. The experiment was allegedly so catastrophically successful and so dangerous to human life that the Navy immediately classified every record of it, suppressed all witnesses, and denied its existence for the rest of recorded history. None of this happened. What did happen in Philadelphia in 1943 is considerably less cinematic and considerably more interesting, in the way that genuine history is always more interesting than mythology, because genuine history connects to real decisions made by real people under real pressure. What happened in Philadelphia in 1943 was degaussing, and degaussing, properly understood, is a story about the intersection of physics, naval engineering, and the lethal ingenuity of naval mines that killed far more Allied ships in the early years of the Second World War than most people today remember. To understand degaussing, it is necessary to understand the magnetic mine. The magnetic mine had been developed in various forms since the First World War, but it was the German deployment of sophisticated magnetic mines in British coastal waters in the autumn of 1939 that demonstrated the weapon's true potential for disruption. The mine itself was not complicated in principle. It was a case containing a large explosive charge, moored or resting on the seabed in shallow water, equipped with a sensor that detected changes in the local magnetic field. A steel ship passing overhead dragged its magnetic field through the water with it. The mine's sensor detected the distortion, measured the intensity, and when the reading crossed a threshold, triggered a detonator. The explosive charge in a German magnetic mine of the period typically weighed between 300 and 700 kilograms of TNT equivalent explosive. A mine detonating directly beneath a ship's keel, with the explosive energy directed upward through water that transmitted blast pressure with extreme efficiency, could break a vessel's keel, flood multiple compartments simultaneously, and destroy machinery mounts, electrical systems, and crew members in portions of the ship that suffered no direct structural damage. The effect was not simply a hole in the hull, it was a systemic shock to every system the ship possessed. In the autumn and winter of 1939, German aircraft and submarines deposited magnetic mines in the Thames estuary, the approaches to British East Coast ports, and other shallow coastal waters with remarkable efficiency. Ships began sinking in waters where no submarine could have placed a contact mine, in channels that had been swept for conventional moored mines, in depths where a torpedo attack was impossible. The losses were significant and, initially, mysterious. The British understood abstractly that magnetic mines existed. Understanding the specific mechanism of any particular weapon well enough to counter it required an example. On the night of November 22, 1939, a German aircraft dropped a magnetic mine onto the tidal mudflats near Shoeburyness in Essex at low tide. The mine, intended to rest on the seabed beneath several meters of water, landed instead in the open air, visible and accessible. The Royal Navy dispatched Lieutenant Commander John Ouvry and Acting Lieutenant Commander Roger Lewis to examine and disarm it. The two men worked without protective equipment, without precedent, and without any certainty that the device would not detonate in their hands. They successfully disarmed the mine, sacrificing their own potential safety to give British scientists the physical specimen they needed to understand what they were facing. The examination of the recovered mine revealed the sensing mechanism in precise detail. The device used a horizontal coil of wire, measuring changes in the vertical component of the local magnetic field. A steel-hulled ship possessed a magnetic signature that had two components. The first was permanent magnetism, built into the ship's steel during construction through the hammering and welding processes that aligned the crystalline structure of the metal in the direction of the Earth's magnetic field at the shipyard's location. The second was induced magnetism, generated by the ship's own electrical systems and by the changing orientation of the ship's steel relative to the Earth's field as the vessel changed course. The combination of these two components produced a distinctive magnetic profile that varied in intensity and pattern depending on the ship's heading, the latitude at which she was operating, and the specific history of her construction. British scientists working with this information identified two possible countermeasures. The first was degaussing, which addressed the ship's permanent magnetic signature by installing electrical cables around the hull and passing a direct current through them. The current generated a magnetic field that, when properly calibrated, cancelled the ship's own permanent magnetic signature. The second was deperming, also called flashing, a more aggressive process in which large electrical cables were wound around the exterior of the ship and energized with a high current to forcibly realign the magnetic domains in the ship's steel, reducing the permanent component of the signature dramatically. The degaussing system that emerged from this work was an engineering solution of considerable elegance. Cables were run in loops around the circumference of the ship, inside the hull, and in some cases outside it, positioned to create a field that offset the ship's own magnetic profile. The current in the cables was adjustable, allowing the system to be tuned for different headings and different latitudes. A ship properly equipped and calibrated could sail through waters containing magnetic mines with significantly reduced risk because her effective magnetic signature had been reduced below the mine's trigger threshold. The system was not perfect. It required calibration. It required the ship to be degaussed at regular intervals because the permanent component of a vessel's magnetism changed over time as the steel experienced mechanical stress, temperature changes, and the cumulative effects of gunfire and near misses. It required a supply of electrical power, which meant that if the ship's generators were damaged in combat, the degaussing system stopped functioning. And it required accurate measurement of the ship's magnetic signature, which was accomplished by running the vessel over a calibration range, a series of magnetic sensors laid on the seabed, and recording the signature at different speeds and headings. The degaussing calibration range, where a ship would pass slowly over underwater sensors while technicians recorded her magnetic profile and adjusted the current in her degaussing cables, was a genuine and visible naval facility. Ships went in, ships came out. Electrical cables were conspicuously wound around hulls. Measurements were taken, adjustments were made. The process was not secret in the sense of being unknown. It was classified in the sense that the specific technical details were not broadcast to the public or to the enemy. But sailors and dock workers and harbor observers saw the cables, saw the ships going through calibration runs, and understood that something was being done to reduce the ship's magnetic signatures. This is where the story of the USS Eldridge begins. The Eldridge was a Cannon-class destroyer escort, hull number DE-173, laid down at the Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Newark, New Jersey, on February 22, 1943. She was launched on July 25, 1943, and commissioned into service on August 27, 1943. She measured 93 meters in length, with a beam of 11 meters and a full load displacement of approximately 1,600 tons. Her complement was approximately 200 officers and men. She was armed with 3-inch guns, torpedo tubes, depth charge throwers, and Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars. She was, in every way, a standard Cannon-class destroyer escort, one of 563 vessels of her type and related classes built during the war. There was nothing exceptional about her. She was equipped, like virtually every American warship of her period, with a degaussing system. The cables were installed during construction and were clearly visible running along her hull. She underwent degaussing calibration at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in August and October of 1943, running over the calibration range in the Delaware River, while technicians measured and adjusted her magnetic signature. These calibration runs are documented in her deck logs, which have been available to researchers at the National Archives since they were declassified decades ago. The logs record the dates, the times, the locations, and the routine nature of the operations. There is no gap in the record, no blacked-out entry, no missing page. The Eldridge then proceeded with her actual service career, which was busy and entirely conventional. She departed Philadelphia in late October of 1943 for shakedown training in Bermuda. She returned, conducted additional operations in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, served as an escort for Atlantic convoys, and ended the war without having been made invisible, teleported, or the subject of any experiment beyond the entirely standard one of having her magnetic signature measured and reduced. Her crew members were not fused into her hull. They were not driven insane. Several of them were, by the 1980s and 90s, living in retirement in various parts of the United States, and they spoke to researchers who tracked them down. Their recollections of the Eldridge's wartime service matched her deck logs with the precision one would expect from men who had simply served on a standard destroyer escort during the Second World War. The mythology of the Philadelphia experiment did not emerge from the wartime period. It emerged in the mid-1950s, from a single source, and spread from there through a predictable sequence of amplifications and elaborations that is almost a textbook case of how conspiracy theories propagate. The source was a man named Carl Meredith Allen, who also used the name Carlos Allende. Allen was a merchant seaman and autodidact who had, in 1945, served aboard the USS Andrew Forsyth, a Liberty ship that had at various points been in the vicinity of the Eldridge during convoy operations. In 1956, a Navy researcher named Morris Ketchum Jessup published a book titled The Case for the UFO, which argued for the existence of extraterrestrial visitation based on various anomalies in astronomical and physical observations. The book was earnest and speculative within the genre of mid-century UFO literature, and it attracted the attention of Allen, who annotated his personal copy with handwritten marginalia covering topics ranging from extraterrestrial physics to a claimed secret Navy experiment that had rendered a ship invisible and transported it instantaneously across space. Allen mailed this annotated copy to the Office of Naval Research in Washington in 1956 or 1957. The Office of Naval Research, whose researchers apparently found the annotations interesting enough to examine but not credible enough to act upon, had a small number of copies made for internal distribution. One of those copies eventually reached Jessup himself, and the story began to escape into a wider readership. The details of the experiment, as Allen described them, were specific enough to seem like genuine intelligence, which is a standard feature of effective conspiracy mythology. Allen claimed that the Eldridge had been made optically invisible through the application of a unified field theory that Albert Einstein had developed and then suppressed because humanity was not ready for it. He claimed that the ship had been teleported from Philadelphia to Norfolk and back. He claimed that crew members had gone mad, had been fused into the ship's structure, had developed the ability to pass through solid matter, and had been institutionalized or killed to prevent them from speaking. He provided no sources, no witnesses by name, no documentation. He was the sole originator of every specific claim. The appeal of the story is not difficult to understand. It appeared in the early years of the Cold War, a period when the military-industrial complex was genuinely conducting secret research of extraordinary ambition, when the atomic bomb had demonstrated that physics could produce results that seemed magical to the uninitiated, and when the government's capacity for secrecy had been demonstrated by the Manhattan Project and other wartime programs. If physicists could split the atom, the implicit reasoning ran, perhaps they could also bend the rules of optics and space. If the government had kept the bomb secret, perhaps it could keep something even more dramatic secret. The Philadelphia experiment slotted neatly into this framework of plausible impossibility. The story was further amplified by the claim of a connection to Albert Einstein. Allen asserted, without evidence, that Einstein had completed a unified field theory that made the experiment possible and had then deliberately suppressed it. Einstein had indeed worked on unified field theory throughout the latter part of his career, attempting to reconcile general relativity and electromagnetism into a single mathematical framework. He had not succeeded. The specific unified field theory that Allen described did not exist, as Einstein himself acknowledged in correspondence before his death in 1955. But the association of the experiment's name with the greatest scientific mind of the century gave it a veneer of credibility that pure invention would have lacked. The story went through a period of relative obscurity after the initial flurry of interest in the late 1950s, and then was dramatically revived in 1979 when two researchers named Charles Berlitz and William Leonard Moore published a book titled The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility. Berlitz was already known for his book on the Bermuda Triangle, another compendium of maritime mysteries that subsequent investigation resolved into a combination of exaggeration, inaccurate statistics, and the selective omission of explanatory context. The Philadelphia Experiment book followed a similar methodology. It presented Allen's original claims as established fact, added layers of additional testimony from unnamed or unverifiable sources, and constructed an edifice of implication and assertion that looked to a reader not already familiar with the underlying lack of evidence, like documented history. The book sold well. It attracted the attention of producers looking for compelling material for the growing genre of paranormal entertainment. In 1984, a feature film titled The Philadelphia Experiment was released, presenting a fictionalized version of events in which sailors from the 1943 experiment were transported to the 1980s. The film was modestly successful and introduced the story to an audience far larger than the book had reached. By the late 1980s, the Philadelphia Experiment had achieved the status of established legend in the culture of paranormal belief, repeated in television documentaries, magazine articles, and the emerging ecosystem of internet discussion boards where such stories found a particularly hospitable environment. The Navy responded to inquiries about the experiment with a consistency that conspiracy theorists naturally interpreted as confirmation of a cover-up. The response was always the same. No such experiment had been conducted. The Eldridge's deck logs showed her to have been elsewhere during the periods in question, and the physical principles allegedly involved were not consistent with anything in physics. This response was entirely accurate. It was also, from the perspective of the conspiracy culture, structurally indistinguishable from what a cover-up would look like. A genuine cover-up and a genuine denial of a fictional event produce the same observable response: official denials. The inability to distinguish between these two possibilities is one of the defining features of unfalsifiable belief systems, and the Philadelphia Experiment mythology had by the 1980s achieved that status. The deck logs of the USS Eldridge, available without restriction at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, tell a story that is impossible to reconcile with the teleportation narrative. On October 28, 1943, the date most frequently cited as the date of the alleged teleportation, the Eldridge's log places her at the Norfolk Naval Operating Base. She had departed Philadelphia days earlier and had not returned. There is no gap in the log, no entry that could be interpreted as covering a period of absence, no anomaly of any kind. The log is routine to the point of tedium, recording watch changes, position fixes, weather observations, and the ordinary administrative details of a destroyer escort going about her business. The crew members who can be traced and interviewed described those days in terms fully consistent with the log. The specific claim that the Eldridge was simultaneously in Philadelphia and Norfolk, which Allen presented as proof of teleportation, reflects a misunderstanding of how naval shore establishment records worked. Ships regularly received communications addressed to their home port while they were at sea or at other ports. Mail, administrative documents, and records addressed to the Eldridge through Philadelphia channels would have continued to move through that administrative pipeline, regardless of where the ship physically was. A researcher encountering these administrative records without understanding the routing conventions of wartime naval paperwork could easily mistake administrative location for physical location. This is not necessarily a dishonest error, but it is an error. The physics of the alleged experiment have been examined by multiple physicists over the decades, and the conclusion is uniform. The electromagnetic systems required to generate a field capable of rendering a ship invisible to visible light would need to operate at frequencies and field strengths that would have required power sources and conductor sizes physically incompatible with mounting on a 1943 destroyer escort. Optical invisibility through electromagnetic means would require manipulating the behavior of photons in wavelengths between approximately 380 and 700 nanometers, the visible spectrum, which is a fundamentally different problem from the low-frequency magnetic field manipulation involved in degaussing. The two phenomena share the word magnetic in their approximate popular description and share essentially nothing else. Degaussing operates at frequencies near zero, what physicists describe as DC or direct current. The magnetic field produced by the degaussing cables does not oscillate. It is a steady, continuous field calibrated to offset the ship's own steady magnetic signature. The frequencies of visible light are approximately 500 terahertz, 14 orders of magnitude higher. The notion that the same physics applies to both, that a system designed to produce a low-frequency magnetic field could, with appropriate modification, produce optical invisibility, reflects a confusion between electromagnetic phenomena that share a mathematical framework, but operate through entirely different mechanisms at entirely different scales. What the degaussing story does illustrate, genuinely and without any need for enhancement, is the remarkable pace at which practical countermeasure technology was developed during the Second World War. The Germans deployed the magnetic mine in September of 1939. The British captured a specimen in November of 1939. By the spring of 1940, degaussing systems were being installed in Royal Navy vessels. The American Navy, learning from the British experience, had developed its own degaussing program and was installing systems in new construction by 1941. The entire cycle from threat identification to practical countermeasure for a problem involving genuinely novel physics applied to novel engineering took less than 18 months. The calibration infrastructure that supported this effort was substantial. The magnetic range in the Delaware River, where the Eldridge underwent her calibration runs in the autumn of 1943, was one of several such ranges established by the American Navy on both coasts and in other protected waters where the seabed sensors could be laid and maintained. Each range required a precisely surveyed seabed layout, calibrated sensing instruments, communications links to shore stations, and trained technicians capable of interpreting the data and calculating the adjustments required to the ship's degaussing current. This was a system that worked, that was maintained throughout the war, and that contributed directly to the survival of ships and crews that would otherwise have been lost to magnetic mines. The mines themselves continued to evolve throughout the war. German engineers, aware that the Allies had developed magnetic countermeasures, introduced influence mines that combined magnetic sensing with acoustic sensing, requiring a ship to trigger both sensors before detonating. They introduced pressure mines, which detected the change in water pressure caused by a ship's hull passing overhead, a phenomenon that no degaussing system could address. They developed delay mechanisms that allowed a mine to let the first several ships pass before activating, so that a swept channel would appear clear until a later vessel triggered it. The engineering contest between mine and countermeasure, operating largely below public awareness throughout the war, was one of the more consequential technical competitions of the conflict. The Eldridge herself survived the war, was transferred to the Greek Navy in 1951 under the name Leon, and served in Greek service until 1992. Her fate after decommissioning was the standard one for aging warships. She was sold for scrap in Greece. the ship that had allegedly been teleported across hundreds of kilometers of American coastline and back, her crew fused into her hull and driven insane by the experience, spent 40 years afterward doing routine destroyer escort work under a foreign flag without any particular difficulty. The Greek Navy, it appears, had not been briefed on her supposed instabilities. Carl Meredith Allen, the origin of the entire mythology, spent the decades after his initial letters in a peripatetic and troubled existence that those who have researched his life describe in terms suggesting serious psychological difficulty. He continued to write and to make claims about the Philadelphia experiment and related matters. He was never able to produce any documentation, any witnesses, or any physical evidence that supported his account. He died in 1994. The researchers who examined his background most thoroughly found a man with an evident fascination with physics and naval history, a capacity for elaborate and internally consistent invention, and no connection to any classified naval program of the 1940s. The actual history of the USS Eldridge is not a story of a miraculous and terrifying experiment conducted in secret. It is the story of a standard Cannon-class destroyer escort, built quickly and well at a New Jersey shipyard, equipped with the latest in magnetic mine countermeasure technology, and sent to sea to do the unglamorous and essential work of protecting Allied convoys from submarines and aircraft. Her crew members were trained professionals doing a dangerous job in dangerous waters. The degaussing system that has been transformed by mythology into a teleportation device was a piece of practical engineering that saved ships and lives throughout the war, not through any disruption of the laws of physics, but through a careful and grounded application of them. That application is the real story. The real story is Lieutenant Commander John Ouvry kneeling in the mud at Shoebury Ness with an unknown German weapon in front of him and a screwdriver in his hand. It is the British scientists who worked through the night to understand the sensing mechanism they had recovered. It is the American naval engineers who adapted the British degaussing system for American ship construction within months of entering the war. It is the calibration range technicians in the Delaware River, recording magnetic signatures and calculating adjustments with instruments that had no room for error. It is the sailors on the Eldridge and 10,000 other ships who went to sea over waters that might or might not contain a mine that their degaussing system might or might not have neutralized, and went anyway. That history requires no embellishment. It has no teleportation and no madness and no invisible ships. It has instead the quiet, relentless competence of people solving real problems under real pressure, with real consequences for failure. The Philadelphia experiment, as mythology, offers the thrill of the impossible made real. The actual history of degaussing offers something that is, in the end, more durable. The record of what human beings can actually accomplish when the problem in front of them is urgent enough and the engineering is sound. The Eldridge's deck logs sit in the National Archives, available to any researcher who wishes to examine them. The dates are there. The position reports are there. The calibration run entries are there. The mundane, irreplaceable truth of what actually happened to one destroyer escort in the autumn of 1943 is preserved in faded ink on aging paper, requiring only the willingness to go and read it.